We can extend the use of our if statements by effectively combining an if formula with one of our most popular mathematical formulas, the sum, the count, and the average, which in themselves then create three new functions: CountIF, SumIF, and AverageIF. So instead of just counting things, we can count things that meet a set criteria. Using our employees file as a working file, what you'll find just to the right of all our data is a mini table where we can use the CountIF function, the SumIF function, and then the AverageIF function. I want to use the CountIF function to actually figure out and count how many people we have employed in each of these four departments. So let's start off with equals CountIF, open brackets. You'll notice that this particular function then requires two input parameters: the range in which to count, and then the criteria to decide which cells within that range to count. Now my range is the column for the department, and because in 2013 I can reference whole columns, I'm just going to click on the column and it can then search down the whole column. So R:R, rather than me saying R2:R, however many rows we want to check, comma. What's the criteria that I want to find within that column? Well, it's the word operations, so I can actually reference the cell to the left here. Return, and it tells me that I have 24 employees working in the operations department. If I then replicate this formula to the bottom of my little list, you'll find that relatively the column is fixed. If you reference a whole column, it is the whole column. You can't suddenly start moving down because you're looking at the whole column anyway, so that's good. And then the relativity here is to move to the next cell down. So I'm looking at sales. When I move down to the next one, which is accounts, I'm looking at the word accounts. Now there is another department in here, clerical. And you'll notice that as soon as I type that and tab across, Excel has then copied this formula down for me. It's the correct formula, and it tells me that there are 19 people in the clerical department. Looking in the department column, finding the word clerical and counting them. Now not only can we use straight matches against text values, with the CountIF we can do clever little mathematical comparisons. So I want to find anybody who earns more than $20,000. So equals CountIF, open brackets. The range this time is the salary column, so that's column O, comma. And my criteria has to be mathematical, so that's greater than 20,000, but it must be encompassed in speech marks, which would seem totally illogical, but it's the way the CountIF function works. So it's greater than 20,000, both the comparison operator and the numeric value are in speech marks that are normally reserved for text values. Return, and it tells me there are 49. I then replicate that down. I still get 49 because in this case the number is contained within the formula. So I need to manually change that to be less than 10,000. And I have one person who earns less than 10,000. So this is slightly different. You're looking at mathematical comparisons. They are achievable, but you need to encompass both the numeric value and the operator within speech marks. Then we're back to mar, sin, and div. Well, effectively that's the same as we were doing above. CountIF. This time my range is the marital status column, so Q, comma, that particular cell there which contains mar, and we have an error. The error being I have an extra set of brackets there. And then return, and I have 43 married. Replicate, 47 singles, 9 divs. So that's CountIF for counting. Now SumIF, logically, is used for adding up. So where we've got the operations as our criteria here, what I'd like to do in the SumIF is actually sum the total salary for anyone that works in operations, in sales, and in accounts. So where the SumIF differs from the CountIF is that the criteria range and the actual range that you're summing can be different. They don't need to be different. You could be summing the same range. But in our case here, we need to check the operations and then sum the salary. So here we have SumIF, open brackets. The first range is the criteria range. So that's this column here, then comma. This is my criteria, the word operations. comma, and then the sum range is the salary. Notice that it is optional, that's why it has square brackets around it. Let's close our brackets and return. And then just a bit of formatting and widening up. Let's go a little bit wider. So the total salary for operations is 663,000. If I then replicate this down to clerical, it will then, because our reference to the criteria is relative, moving down moves the criteria reference down to now look at warehousing and then clerical, and we get the total salary bill for each of our departments. So that's using SumIF. SumIF, the criteria range, the criteria, and then the sum range if it's not the same as the criteria range. Now we can do here similar thing as we did with the CountIF. This time we won't need a separate criteria and sum range because everything's going to happen on the salary column. So that's our salary column. Criteria is the same as before, needs to be in speech marks even though it's numeric with a comparison operator. And then we don't need the sum range because our criteria range is the same thing. So we just close brackets and return. And the total salary for everybody that earns more than 20,000 is 1,475,495. Let's replicate, then change the criteria. Our criteria being less than 10,000. And it's only one person, we know that from the CountIF, and that person earns 9,500. Our last one here is let's sum salary bill for each of our marital status. So it equals SumIF, open brackets, marital status column, comma, the criteria cell, comma, the column that's going to be summed. Brackets, return, bit of formatting so that when we replicate, the formatting is retained and the criteria moves down. So SumIF marital status is the criteria column. V16 contains the criteria, in this case div, and then column O is the salary column that we're adding up. So SumIF adds up based on a criteria. I'm sure logically you could now pretty much work out AverageIF yourself. This will work out the average based on a criteria. So AverageIF, open brackets, just like the SumIF, it requires two ranges. The second range is optional in that if you're averaging the same column that criteria is in, then you don't need to mention it twice. For our first one here, then we want to average the salary for each of our departments. Criteria range is the department, comma, the criteria is the name of the department, comma, and the averaging range is the salary. And then return, bit of formatting, and we find that the average salary for operations is 27,626. And if we replicate, we then get the average salary for each of our departments. Now you can actually do a little check on this because the average salary should be total salary divided by the number of people in that department. If I replicate that down, these figures should be exactly the same. So I can see that AverageIF is doing what it's supposed to do. We can do the same again here using a numeric comparison. So AverageIF, range is the salary, criteria, just as the other two in the same family, must have the numeric values inside speech marks. Bit of formatting. So the average salary of people who earn more than 20,000 is actually 30,000. Replicate but change the criteria. Now, without even trying to work this out, because it's one person, 9,500, I know that the average is going to be 9,500. And it is. And then we do the same for our mar, sin and div. Well, let's copy this formula here. Now it says divo. That's because we're checking the wrong column. We're looking at the right criteria, which is V14, but we shouldn't be checking column R. We should be checking column Q. So let's move the reference across column Q. It now says look in column Q for your criteria and then work out the average of O. The average salary for a married person is 26,000. Let's replicate. It's only 17 for a single person, and for a divorced it's 25,000. So that's three very useful functions that combine mathematical ability and if checking ability in a single function, which saves you having to do an if and a sum. You do it all in one function: SumIF, CountIF, and AverageIF.